Hi, everyone. I am Bulwark Senior Editor Ben Parker here with Cato Senior Fellow Patrick Eddington. He's an expert in national security and the Bill of Rights and has a very interesting piece in the Bulwark. Trump could do a mass deportation. We've done it before. So mass deportation has become Trump's signature policy proposal in this campaign. There were signs at the Republican convention that said mass deportations now. It's like this updated version of the 2016 Muslim ban. It's like the one concrete, ridiculous proposal he has. And his number keeps on going up. I've seen estimates that there are maybe 7 million illegal immigrants in the country, maybe 11 million. He says 15, sometimes even higher. He keeps on inflating the number. So how realistic is it that he could actually deport these people if he were to win?
Well, first off, Ben, it's great to be with you and the rest of the Bulwark crew here. I am a supporter and a fan, so this is a real treat for me. Really appreciate you having me. Yeah, when I was 17 years old, I went door to door for Ronald Reagan in 1980, and to see what happened at the RNC convention just a few weeks ago with those horrific signs, mass deportation now being held up, it's a measure of just exactly, how far down essentially our country has come morally and politically. But the sad truth is, as I note in the piece that you all published today, is that this is unfortunately not necessarily a new phenomenon, right? I mean, we go all the way back to the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 and the so-called Alien Friends Act, was used essentially to go after persons of French ancestry and origin. And it was also used by the Federalists to go after their political enemies, right? And then, we fast forward a few decades to the 1830s, and President Jackson defies the Supreme Court and begins this mass relocation, this forced relocation of Native Americans out of the eastern United States to west of the Mississippi River. I mean, in direct violation of the Supreme Court. And we continue to go through, obviously, in the piece and cite a number of other incidents that, of course, are much more modern. The biggest one being, and this really kind of does get to the heart of what, I think Trump would really like to be able to emulate. It was literally 70 years ago this year that the Eisenhower administration engaged in this thing called Operation Wetback, which was designed essentially to expel as many illegal aliens, particularly, from south of our border with Mexico, as possible. And by the time they were done with it, they estimated that they managed to expel, over 1 million. And so the notion, and we have to remember, that's 1954. That's before the Department of Homeland Security even existed. It's before, this massive growth in the size of the federal law enforcement community. So the notion that Trump would not be able to do this, at least from a federal manpower standpoint, law enforcement manpower standpoint, augmented by state and local law enforcement personnel, it's magical thinking. There's no question he could do it.
Yeah, so you have a bunch more historical examples that we will definitely talk more about. That's really the meat of the piece, is how often we've done things like this in our past as a country. But also, you were telling me about this a little bit before we started recording, a little bit about the legal authority. So we can put aside for a second, like, is there precedent? You made a connection that I hadn't understood before between what we saw in the summer of 2020, where there were DEA agents, Drug Enforcement Agency agents, like throwing people out of Lafayette Park in DC, or driving around in unmarked government cars, arresting people who were protesting or in some cases rioting in places like Portland, Oregon for the Black Lives Matter protests.
Yes.
You connected that to the mass deportation. So could you tell me more about those legal authorities and how they work?
Yeah. When it comes to this kind of activity, the ability essentially to utilize both other federal agencies, as a normal practice, obviously it's the U.S. Border Patrol that's most heavily engaged, in essentially trying to round up or otherwise intercept persons coming across our border who are not legally here. But the federal law enforcement institution now is just so massive. You have Homeland Security investigations, you have Immigrations and Custom Enforcement, you have the U.S. Marshal Service, and it just kind of goes on. In addition to the FBI, of course, which has a slightly different mission. But I think everyone kind of gets the point there. And in 1996, when immigration was once again, kind of a hot button issue, they made a change to the Immigration and Nationality Act, which has been on the books, literally for decades. to include this new provision called 287G. And what that gives them the ability to do is essentially deputize state and local law enforcement personnel to go out and engage in selective immigration enforcement activities. So it's a way essentially of extending the reach of ICE and HSI and the Border Patrol to go and basically round up people. And then there's another authority that could potentially be used here if they wanted to try to employ, the DEA essentially for this kind of activity. And it's an authority under Title 21. And that's the one that you were actually talking about with respect to how then Attorney General Barr responded to the Black Lives Matter protest in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. And under that particular Title 21 authority, which I've written about extensively elsewhere, they were able to basically take DEA agents and, put them out on the street. They engage in surveillance. They engage in arrest operations. Normally, DEA is involved in counter-narcotics operations. But that authority, that Title 21 authority I'm referring to, was utilized to let them go out and engage in other activities. And it's a very broad authority that the Attorney General has there. So there are just a lot of tools, and I talk about, some of the other statutes that are already on the books that give essentially, any president the ability to engage in this kind of conduct. The difference, however, between previous presidents and a future President Trump is that Mr. Trump, as you've indicated so perfectly, he and his confederates, his most close associates, and in theory, perhaps future DHS secretary, want to get back in the game and they want to double down. And obviously, this is something that is just red meat for his political base.
Yeah, it absolutely is. So I want to talk about these historical examples you raise, and I want to talk about the actual effects, because this is where I think your piece has a lot to offer an understanding of the precedent of what Trump is suggesting. So you started with the Alien Friends Act of 1798, way back at the beginning of the country, the Adams administration. So who are the friends and who are the aliens? And since we're talking about mass deportations, who actually got deported?
In that particular circumstance, they were, targeting the French essentially, because there was a lot of tension between the United States and France during that particular period of time. This is well after the French Revolution. This is also during the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. And some French warships were engaged in depredations against, U.S. commerce, things of that nature. But there was just kind of this general xenophobia, essentially, that the Federalists had whipped up. And it wasn't, of course, just aimed at, persons of French ancestry. It was almost anybody, of foreign ancestry. But it was also aimed, of course, at their opponents, their political opponents. And this is where you see them, ultimately using these kinds of authorities to go after non-Federalist newspapers. And there was an awful lot of that took place. Now, an awful lot of folks essentially self-deported. And Wendell Bird, whose magnificent book from just a few years ago, Criminal Descent, chronicles this in incredible detail, shows that just the threat, essentially, of mass deportations was enough to get people to leave. The same thing, I should note, clearly happened during Operation Wetback during the Eisenhower administration. So just by beginning to create a climate of fear, essentially, among particular ethnic communities, the administration, a future Trump administration, could have the effect of essentially, convincing a lot of people to basically get out of town, so to speak, before ICE or HSI or any other deputized agent shows up, to try to get them. And I think the other thing to really kind of talk about here, just very briefly at least, is what happened during World War I. After the declaration of war, a tremendous amount of anti-German sentiment, was stirred up in this country. And President Wilson actually is directly responsible for this. I mean, he began attacking German Americans as essentially disloyal as early as 1915 in public speeches, even though he had no evidence that a single German American, was actually a spy for Kaiser Wilhelm I and his intelligence services. But it didn't matter. And so, after, of course, the declaration of war, there was just this tremendous anti-German sentiment that was spread throughout the country. And as a result, German Americans were even killed. Many were physically assaulted. Their newspapers essentially came under attack and pressure to basically shut down. And even German language church services, for really old German immigrants, were basically attacked as unpatriotic, and things of that nature. So a really, really, really ugly episode. And in many respects, it was repeated in World War II when we saw the roundup of Japanese Americans And what's really scandalous, the whole episode is scandalous, but what makes it even more so, as far as I'm concerned, Ben, is that the U.S. intelligence community, specifically naval intelligence, had concluded before Pearl Harbor and even again after Pearl Harbor that the overwhelming majority of Japanese Americans would never be a loyalty problem. They were loyal to the United States. And of course, many of them, including the late Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii, wound up serving, in the U.S. Army or elsewhere in the U.S. military during World War II as a way to try to prove, to every other American that, yes, we're with you, we're no different than you, and all the rest of that. But the level of hate, the level of violence that was leveled against and perpetrated against Japanese Americans even after the internment was over is just horrific. And I talk about a lot of this in my forthcoming book coming in 2025, The Triumph of Fear, which is about these kinds of phenomenon, among other things.
I want to talk more about World War II in a second, but just I think this is what you said about World War I is one of the really important implications of the history you've traced. It's the interplay of the official deportation actions and the unofficial climate it creates. This is something you also mentioned about the earlier examples, that if you want 15 million people to leave, you don't need to physically move 15 million people. A lot of them will just move out of a climate of fear. And that, these things are mutually reinforcing, right? Yeah. A climate of ethnic hostility against Germans. German Americans are not considered like an ethnic group in this country anymore, I think it's fair to say, but they used to be a significant, distinct ethnic minority. Yeah. And just, the climate of hostility then feeds into government policy, which then reinforces the climate of hostility. Yes. Something that's pretty familiar. But also, before we get back to World War II, the famous Palmer raids, right, were partially ethnically motivated. These were also under Wilson, his Attorney General Palmer, after World War I. What were those about?
Well, a lot of this, of course, was being driven by what most historians would refer to as the first Red Scare, right? I mean, the Bolshevik Revolution had been successful in Russia. The communists had taken control. And, in the first 20 years of the 20th century, socialist and communist ideas had gained a lot of purchase here in America, especially socialist ideas. Eugene V. Debs, was a perennial Socialist Party candidate, for a number of years. And he was also jailed during World War I by Wilson, again, on, essentially trumped up charges. And the Espionage Act, that's something else we haven't even talked about. But in that particular context, that's what they went after Debs on. But the deportation actions were designed essentially to go after anarchists, but also especially people that have been tagged as socialist and communist. And, hundreds, at least hundreds at the end of the day were deported from the United States. And a lot of the charges against them were completely spurious. They really didn't have a basis. And this is, again, a very common theme that we see oftentimes, that charges will simply be leveled. This happened, all throughout the entire Cold War in terms of people being put on what was known as the custodial detention list. That was started in the early 1940s, basically targeting, German and Italian Americans, but also persons of German and Italian ancestry.
By the FBI, right?
That was a cornerstone program with the late J. Edgar Hoover at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And, the name changed once the Cold War, really kicked off after 1945. They simply renamed it the Emergency Detention Program. And I have personally seen and copied records at the National Archives at College Park on prominent Americans, native-born Americans who were on that list. And it includes prominent civil rights and civil liberties attorneys like the late Leonard Boudin. It includes right-wing figures like Lyndon LaRouche, but also, some left-wing privacy and civil liberties advocates like the late Frank Wilkinson.
And the idea was, in an emergency, these are American citizens that would be arrested just because.
Yeah, and to be clear, that emergency detention program was very heavily focused on folks of Slavic origin, known Soviet operatives, known East European communist operatives, intelligence operatives, diplomats, individuals of that character. But the net was very wide, and one of the problems we have been is that so many of those records, especially for the emergency detention program, have never been made public. I mean, it's in the millions and millions of pages that I'm sure. And, I'm working along with, I think, probably some other historians to try to get that material out into the public domain. But it's very daunting because the National Archives has never been, funded, resourced enough, to really get it done. And there are also some other internal policies, I think, that also contribute to that stuff just not getting out the way that it should. But the long story short here is that we have a history dating back to just 10 years after the ink on the Constitution being dry of engaging in this kind of insanity. And it's just simply another example of this kind of otherization. And what I find really terrifying at this point in time is the way that Trump and his principal advisors, his principal surrogates, have really just amped this up and turned it into such an abominable issue that if he is actually successful in regaining the White House, he will absolutely attempt to implement this. And that's the other point that I think, really motivated me to write the piece. I referenced that New York Times piece from a couple of weeks ago in which, even people like, former DHS Secretary Janet Napolitano were essentially kind of poo-pooing the idea that this could be done, at scale. And I was just horrified that in that particular Times piece, there was no reference at all to any of these prior historical examples. And if we want to prevent this kind of thing from happening, we can't memory hole the previous examples. We've got to go back. We've got to educate people. We've got to remind people. And that's why I appreciate the opportunity to do this with the Bulwark.
Yeah, no, it's a great piece. I highly recommend everyone read it. There's two more things I want to hit on before we're done, because I learned these from your piece. I didn't really known about this before. You do mention, in addition to the more than 100,000 Japanese Americans who were interred during World War II, including the late Senator Inouye. I actually had a chance pretty recently to see where he's buried in the National Military Cemetery of the Pacific in Hawaii. It's a beautiful spot. No question about his loyalty when you see his grave there. It's amazing.
Absolutely.
But you also mentioned the internment of German and Italian Americans at the same time.
Yes.
And that even some of those people were deported. Were they deported back to Germany and Italy? Tell me more about that.
Yes. I mean, there have actually been books, written about some of these, specific cases. And in one particular case, I recall that involved some German Americans. Some of the children were deported back to Germany, post-war Germany, and they didn't make it back to the United States for more than 10 years, right? So, this is real. And the same kind of thing happened, with Operation Wetback during the Eisenhower administration.
That's the other one I wanted to ask you about. Yeah. So with what force did they deport all of these millions of people back to Mexico?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, we talked earlier about, the self-deportation, but these mass roundups that took place, I'm sure that folks were bussed back. I don't know how much in the way of air travel was necessarily used back then. But I'm sure a lot of land travel, was involved in getting these folks, out of the country and managing to do it at scale. But there were native-born persons of Mexican or other Central American or South American ancestry who wound up being deported.
American citizens.
Yes.
As rounded up and sent out of the country.
Yeah, as part of Operation Wetback. Now, even if it's only a few, that's still outrageous. And what I worry about in terms of, what Mr. Trump seems to have in mind, should he regain the Oval Office, is that he won't really care if his people are not terribly discriminating, about what they're doing. And I think it's also worth mentioning because of the research that my Cato colleague, Alex Naraste, has done on this topic. But the Border Patrol, the U.S. Border Patrol, has among the highest turnover and highest disciplinary rates of any federal law enforcement agency. I mean, there's always been controversy about Border Patrol violence, including lethal use of force against folks. And just imagine a scenario in which a decision is made by a new Trump administration to essentially use all these other authorities I've been talking about to deputize state and local personnel, state and local law enforcement across the country to go and engage in this kind of activity. How selective are they really going to be? I really fear badly, for what could happen here.
Yeah, no, I think you make an excellent case that the people who think that this kind of thing isn't possible underestimate both the degree to which a small government action can spur on a larger sort of mass public action, hysteria, and the unbelievable powers the federal government currently has under laws that were passed, not even that recently.
Yes, exactly.
So I recommend the piece to everyone. It's on the Bulwark right now. Trump could do a mass deportation. We've done it before by Patrick Eddington. Thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.